I'm Julian Zelizer of the Long View, and I'm here with Charlie Sykes of To the Contrary to continue with our conversations about Trump 2.0. Charlie, welcome back.
Welcome back. Hell of a week.
Hell of a week. On foreign policy, you have the new Monroe Doctrine, the Donroe Doctrine, as the president has called it, good old fashioned imperialism, different names being used to describe what happened in Venezuela. What do you see as being the significance of this week in terms of what's happening with foreign policy under Trump 2.0?
Well, Trump's foreign policy is clearly unleashed. He gave that interview to the New York Times the other night where he was asked about the constraints of international law, and he said, basically, who cares? The only limit on my power to make war, to shake countries down, or to do anything, is I think he's traded with my own morality, my own mind. There are no other limits. And I think that was dawning on a lot of people who perhaps had thought that he was bluffing or that he wasn't serious. Um, so I do think that we're seeing this raw sort of neo-imperialism, without any of the normal glosses about democracy or freedom. He and Stephen Miller are making it very, very clear this is about, the iron fist of power. Might makes right. This is not about the opposition. This is about oil, and it's right there in front of us. And you can see the Europeans now are starting to realize, so this guy, is he serious about Greenland? Is he really going to take it? This may have been the week where he drove a dagger through the heart of NATO.
And we've operated for many decades with a different kind of system that checked, not perfectly, but at least created some checks on foreign policy being guided by the internal beliefs and desires of the president of the United States. I mean, you're a student of conservatism. This is not always how conservatism imagined foreign policy, right?
Well, certainly not since World War II. And this is such a complete departure from that. I mean, in effect, he is dismantling the world order. He is dismantling the international system that has kept the peace since the end of World War II. But could I make a slightly contrarian take to this?
Yeah.
When Donald Trump says there's nothing that constrains me except my own morality, my own mind, he's not totally wrong. But this is a reminder of why character matters so much.
Mhm.
We have invested so much power in the presidency. We are the world's existing superpower, towering over the world. And we have relied upon the decency, the honor, the honesty, the restraint, the prudence of the president of the United States. So when we have these esoteric conversations about, we want a strong man or a good man. Well, okay, so we now have someone in power who basically he sees his role as kind of a mafia boss. And when he says, there are no restraints except my own morality, go, holy crap, because we know what Donald Trump's morality is. And he's not wrong when he says that there's really no one to check him or to stop him.
No, as always, he's very honest about the situation and much more direct than even many of his critics. Do you think so if that's the check, are there any limits from what you can see to what he would do or wouldn't do? I mean, in foreign policy in general, but certainly in the region where we just saw the Venezuelan leader taken in broad daylight.
Well, the answer is yes and no. We talk about international law, whether he's violating international law, and I guess the cynical question is, what is this legality we're talking about? Who's going to enforce it? Who's going to stop the United States? And that's kind of the Stephen Miller position. If we want to take Greenland, we can take Greenland because we're powerful. Nobody's going to stop us. Now, having said that, there are constraints in reality. If in fact the Europeans were to stand up more aggressively than simply writing, strongly worded letters to Trump, if they were to put, say, tripwire troops on the ground in Greenland, that would, I think, be a check. If we actually had a functioning Congress, an issue that you and I have talked about extensively, we could have Congress reassert some of its war power. I thought it was interesting that the Senate voted to
Yeah.
limit his ability to wage war in Venezuela. Now, it was largely symbolic. It's not actually going to have any real world effect, but it reminds us what the world might look like if we actually had a functioning Congress.
Do you think we were talking before we started about how, for a lot of people, and I've had the same conversations this week, felt more unsettling than many others, the combination of Venezuela and Minneapolis, which we can get to. Do you think this reverberates at all in the electorate in ways that are different than other things that the president has done?
You know, it's funny you should mention that because it did feel that this week, the weight, the burden, the weight of it, of what was possible, was, was felt very, very graphic. Like, and I told, a podcast host from London last night, I said, I'll be honest with you, I have felt rattled this week, rattled by this sense that things are really running off the track, what they are capable of doing, what they're capable of lying about, what they're capable of rationalizing. And I got a phone call this morning from my daughter who lives in France, who asked me almost word for word the question that you asked. Is it, how do people feel about this? How is this resonating with the electorate? Are the American people okay with this? You know, the United States functioning as a mafia organization, running a protection racket around the world, shooting people in the streets and defending them. And I said, I don't know. I don't know. It's way too early to know this is a tipping point. We've seen how strong these tribal ties are, and the willingness of MAGA to continually adjust their standards to accommodate this. So I don't know, but this week did feel heavier. And if people are feeling rattled, trust me, I'm hearing that from a lot of folks. You are not alone if this felt worse than usual. And I think maybe and you could sort of sense that, the Stephen Millers and the Kristi Noems and the Donald Trumps, I mean, they feel that they're pumped up. I mean, if you want to know what hubris looks like and sounds like, listen to them over the last 3 or 4 days.
Is there, I mean, and the other thing I was just thinking, I mean, he did this through a policing legal path rather than a military path, which does create the, like, what happens if the judge and the court don't in the end agree with the case that the president is bringing? I don't totally understand how that plays out either, given you have the former president here at this point. So you could have a
Well,
potential clash.
you could have a potential class, and think of the precedent that you are creating. If in fact it is the position of the administration that we can invade any country based on a criminal indictment, well, that
Right.
that basically carves Congress completely out of the process, which has basically happened already. I mean, they have been a nullity. But what was interesting was watching all the various and completely conflicting explanations for this. On the one hand, it's a law enforcement operation, right? Then Donald
Yeah.
Trump himself uses the word kidnapping. We kidnapped him. Stephen Miller goes on CNN and says, damn right, we invaded Venezuela and now we control it. We're going to run it. We're going to, keep all of their oil. Donald Trump is going to control all the money. This seems like the the fig leaf of it being a simple law enforcement operation is very, very shaky. But again, as Donald Trump says, I can do what I want. I mean, this is the reality. Donald Trump is sitting there, and the new imperial, Don Roe doctrine is I can do anything I want because I am the strongest, the biggest stick on the block, and I am going to exert my hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. And this is not us parsing it out. They're very direct, very clear about it. And the question is, what is anyone going to do about it? We don't know yet.
Do you think, I saw you interviewed Laura Field, who wrote this book about the intellectual history of MAGA Republicanism? So there's Trump and how he describes what he's doing. And then there's the world around him and the administration, some of whom have kind of views like a Stephen Miller. Is there some coherent view of foreign policy that would help us, do you think, make sense of what, regardless of whether you support it, what they're trying to do with foreign policy? Or is this just random strongman action?
Well, this is complicated because we're dealing with
Yeah.
the mind of Donald Trump, who governs and runs his life and the country by whim. So, does Donald Trump have a coherent view of the world? Absolutely not. If you're looking for a coherent strategy in Donald Trump's mind, no. However, The caveat there is that there are people around him who have a very, very clear idea of what they want to accomplish. And the fact that they put this in writing, this national security document that came out a few weeks ago, and I was glad that they put it out. I was glad that they wrote it out so that we can actually see what their vision of the world is.
Mhm.
And it was a complete rejection of the Western democracies. It was a complete rejection of the settlement that we have had since World War II. It was made it very clear that they had no investment in NATO and that they were embracing this kind of sphere of influence approach. The Russians loved it. They thought it was absolutely fantastic. And quite frankly, if you look at that document, you can see the bare bones architecture of what is actually playing out in real time. So, there is the yes and the no. No, Donald Trump is not a coherent thinker or strategist. Yes, there are people who clearly have an agenda. Now, how this plays out between the America First isolationists and the new MAGA imperialists, I don't know. It's going to be very interesting to watch because there are real strains and there are real tensions within that movement.
And we're just one last point on this. I mean, some argue there's a direct line between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. Despite the differences of them, there's a trajectory. On foreign policy, you shook your head. Can you explain why you don't think that's true and what some of the differences are?
Well, Donald Trump, I mean, Ronald Reagan, believed in American exceptionalism. He believed that America was the shining city on the hill. He was committed to the Western alliance completely. Now, of course, the world was different then. We were in the midst of the Cold War. He had a very, very clear view of which side we were on. You can disagree with him, but he believed that it was the United States as the leader of the free world, a position he took very seriously, versus what was called the axis of evil at the time. Donald Trump does not believe in American exceptionalism. He believes in American power, American opportunism. And he has switched sides in that Cold War. He has aligned himself with the hegemons of the world. He obviously has much closer ties with, I mean, he admires Vladimir Putin while he despises the democratic leaders of Western Europe. Now, look, you can make a lot of criticisms of Ronald Reagan, but Ronald Reagan was the guy who said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Um, Donald Trump is basically saying, Mr. Putin, you can pretty much do what you want. There is not a straight line. Now, the fact is, look, Reagan and Bush did have, adventurism in this hemisphere. They did invade Grenada. Um, they went into Panama, but there are distinctions to those things. There were actual threats. I think the precedents don't look great now as we look back on them. But Donald Trump does not even pretend that he is advancing the causes of freedom, democracy, truth, or justice. And I think that's the real fundamental thing. Now, your listeners may think, well, Ronald Reagan was full of shit. He didn't really believe those things. I think he did. But the fact that, in the eyes of the world, Donald Trump makes no pretense. And I want to make 2 points because I also interviewed Ann Applebaum this week, and she made a fantastic point. What's happening now will change the way the rest of the world looks at America, but it's also going to change the way Americans think about themselves as Americans. I mean, we think of ourselves still as kind of the good guys, that we have been a force for good in the world. And after a decade of this, after the smash and grab policies of Donald Trump and Stephen Miller, what does that do to America's sense of self, their self-image, their sense of self-worth? And I think that's a frightening question to think about.
And the rhetoric matters. I mean, just to add to what you're saying, and I know many people listening would point to El Salvador, Nicaragua, but there was a very clear kind of vision that Reagan at least articulated, whatever he believed, that's just gone. I mean, President Trump doesn't even pretend to talk about those goals anymore. And he's often sympathetic to autocratic rather than democratic movements in the world.
Well, I think it was significant that in Venezuela, he almost immediately threw the opposition under the bus, and the Democratic opposition in Venezuela is quite formidable. These are not. This is not a marginal group. They won the last election overwhelmingly, and then they were able to prove it. You had the leader of the opposition winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And yet, when it came to, hey, what happens with the future of Venezuela, Donald Trump made it very clear that it was more important to him to get the oil than to have elections or to replace the Maduro regime. And I thought that was an incredible tell. By the way, you hear that is that Ms. Machado is going to go to the White House and will give her Nobel Prize to Donald Trump.
Wow.
Was a report about that. Now,
I
I don't
didn't
know
hear.
that the Nobel Peace Prizes are transferable. I don't know that you can actually do that, but
Right.
there's going
Seems.
to be that element of farce now involving this.
All right. Turning to Minneapolis. I mean, your thoughts and should we think of this? How do you think of it in terms of, is this a bad apples being supported by the administration, or is this a natural outcome of the administration's policy that was going to happen and will happen again?
No, the latter. There's no question about it. This was inevitable. This is what is going to happen when you have a policy based on fear, force, and frankly brutality. You remember a few weeks ago there was an incident where I think protesters were vandalizing some ICE vehicles or throwing things at them, and the president of the United States issued an order, which I think will have legal and historic significance, where he directed the Department of Homeland Security basically to use any force necessary to, protect the vehicles, anything necessary, which certainly implies the kind of violence that we saw in Minneapolis and then in Portland last night. So I think that as they cultivate this sort of thuggish brute squad mentality, this sort of thing is going to continue to happen. I think this is the 10th time that ICE
Yeah.
agents have fired into vehicles. So this is not a one-off. And you see this from the defense. The immediate, this woman, we didn't even know her name. I'm sorry, her body was not even cold when Christy Nome is calling her a domestic terrorist, when Donald Trump is smearing her as somehow, deserving what she got. A JD Vance holds a press conference where he says the agent has absolute immunity, absolute immunity to kill people on the street, and then blames her for her murder. What makes this different, of course, is that we had those videotapes, which you and all of your listeners have seen, which I think make it very, very clear that he did not act in self-defense, that this was a police murder in Minneapolis, and the fact that the administration and MAGA supporters are defending it so aggressively is the answer to your question.
You think it was, I mean, it was stunning to watch the sequence of responses from the president to the vice president in that press conference and Nome and more. Do you think this is kind of, and I know we're speculating, is this a deliberate strategy that when something like this happens quickly, almost in McCarthyite ways, send out blame on the person who was killed and kind of create an atmosphere that makes you distrust what you just clearly see over and over again with your own eyes?
Yes, absolutely. And the fact that
Yeah.
this occurred the week of the anniversary of January 6th, where
Yep.
they had completely revised that history, turned the world upside down. So, yes, I think that their reaction was reflexive, indicating exactly what the strategy is: never admitting mistakes, never backing off, always leading with the iron fist, always characterizing all of your opponents as domestic terrorists. And by the way, this seems obvious to mention, but it is important. A couple of weeks ago, remember Pam Bondi put out this new guideline on dealing with terrorism, in which she defined almost anyone who was critical of the Trump administration policies in MAGA as being domestic extremists and terrorists. Well, those words have consequences. And if you begin to redefine any sort of defense or civil disobedience as domestic terrorism, you have escalated then the stakes and what the government would be allowed to do. Because it's one thing, to rough up, a protester who's exercising their First Amendment rights or engaging in some sort of like a sit-in. It is something else to say that they are domestic terrorists who therefore bring it on themselves if we shoot them in the head and kill them. So these words, you know, all of these things are downstream from dehumanization and the vilification of the opposition. The dehumanization is central to what they're doing, I think, in terms of the immigration and the deportation, and the vilification is central to the way they're dealing with the opposition.
And it would have been easy for the administration to say, don't rush to judgment. We will investigate this and we will figure it out. Instead,
Right.
it was minutes before they're doing what you're saying, which is a very particular narrative about what happened for any information other than the video was out there.
So this is a really important point, Julian, and I hope that people stop there because I think we've become so inured to it. There is an alternative scenario where you have a killing, you could have someone express concern. I mean, at least even thoughts and prayers. There was none of
Right.
that. Or the decade-long tradition of saying, you know what, let's not rush to judgment. We are doing an investigation. You should trust the investigation. These things would have been completely legitimate responses to say, we're going to be bringing in, forensic experts. We're going to be looking at this. We're going to be reviewing the policy, and we, certainly mourn the loss of innocent life, whatever. None of that happened. So if you want to know like how abnormal all of this is, think of that Earth 2.0, where law enforcement actually behaves in a restrained, prudent way. Wait, do not rush to judgment. The rush to judgment was so startlingly fast, but again, very much on brand.
And well, before we get to the final questions, thank you to all the subscribers who are watching us now, who watch us when we post this. Thank you to paid subscribers. I think this kind of moment is, again, why you need independent journalism to work through these kinds of issues. So if you'd consider becoming a paid subscriber to our Substacks, we appreciate it because that is how we continue to do this work. We're doing it on our own. So thank you for considering that. Can I ask we haven't spoken, Marjorie Taylor Greene stepping out of Congress. There's been a lot of stories on why she's doing it. I'm curious what your take is. I haven't fully reached a conclusion of why she did this and what the implications, if any, are of her leaving.
Well, first of all, I think it's an indication how you don't need to be an actual member of Congress or an elected official anymore to be relevant in American politics. In fact, as Congress has turned itself into potted plants, people are going, "Do I actually need to be tied down to this pointless job? I can go out and be an influencer by having a podcast or a live stream or appearing on The View." So Martin Taylor Greene has not lost any prominence by leaving Congress, which is another indication of how our politics has changed. It used to be that if you wanted to be a major player, you run for office, you'd be a member of Congress, you get on committees, you pass legislation, you engage in debate. That is so last century now. So Marjorie Taylor Greene is not going away. I am more skeptical than others about the new Marjorie Taylor Greene. I think you saw that earlier this week when she's defending Trump on January 6th. Marjorie Taylor Greene has not seen the light. She is attacking Trump from deeper from within the MAGA swamps. Now, she's not wrong on the Epstein files. She's not wrong on calling out the hypocrisy and the failures of the administration. But I would certainly slow walk the embrace of Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, remember who she is and where she comes from and what she has said and done and continues to say and do.
Yeah, I mean, the one part that's plausible to me, which she has been part of creating the problem, is the threats to her family, which is now part of politics. It's part of the courts. It's a horrendous development in American democratic life that violence is a normal threat that you receive if you step on the wrong side of the line.
Well, this is another point that I hope that we to take a moment to take a beat on all of this. That you're absolutely right. This has become a norm. And again, imagine the alternative in which leaders of both parties decide that no, we need to draw a line right here. We have seen too much death, too much bloodshed, too many threats, too much fear. Let's stop it. That's not happening.
Right.
In fact, people are accepting it, not overtly accepting it, but they accept it by not pushing back against it. How does Donald Trump react when Marjorie Taylor Greene says that she and her son have received threats? Basically, he blames the victim. He blames other people. So this is the bat signal that has gone out now for years that, wink, wink, this is okay. If you really care about me, if you really, really care passionately, I'm going to look the other way when you attack the Capitol, when you threaten my opponents or my critics.
Well, an unsettling week, but I am glad we got to talk about it and put it in some perspective and kind of move through what's true and what's not true, which we need more of in these days. So thanks, Charlie Sykes. To the contrary, thanks for talking. We'll talk again soon and Happy New Year.
Thank you so much, and
Okay.
hopefully a happy.
Bye bye.